"You're homeless, and I'm childless," the giant cowboy stated simply to the poor woman. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities and desperate hopes. The unlikely encounter was about to change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The stars hung like distant lanterns over Redemption Ridge as John Silva stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, his massive frame silhouetted against the night sky. The emptiness stretched before him, both in the dark expanse of his land and in the hollow chambers of his heart. Tonight, the loneliness cut deeper than the prairie wind that whispered through the tall grass, carrying memories he couldn't outrun. John's calloused fingers gripped the porch railing as his mind wandered to Anna. 5 years gone now, yet her absence remained as raw as an open wound. They had dreamed of filling these rooms with children, of laughter echoing through hallways now silent as a tomb. The rancher closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that silence pressing down on him like a physical burden, growing heavier with each passing season. Miles away in town, Maria Oliveira pulled her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders, her back pressed against the rough wooden wall of the livery. The smell of hay and horses offered little comfort as she gathered her children closer. 8-year-old Lucia sat with quiet dignity beside her, dark eyes watchful and too old for her young face. 6-year-old Pedro had finally fallen into fitful sleep, his small head resting in his mother's lap. "Mama, I'm hungry," Lucia whispered, though she tried to hide the tremor in her voice. Maria stroked her daughter's hair, swallowing the knot of despair threatening to choke her. "I know, meu amor. Tomorrow will be better." The words tasted like ash on her tongue, the same hollow promise she'd made for weeks now. 3 months had passed since the wagon accident that took her husband's life, leaving nothing but debts and desperation. The widow had sold everything of value, worked every odd job available, but Redemption Ridge offered little mercy to a foreigner with 2 hungry children. Tonight, with nowhere else to turn, they huddled behind the livery, the cold night air seeping through their threadbare clothes. Pedro whimpered in his sleep, his small face pinched with hunger. Maria bent to kiss his forehead, her tears falling silently onto his cheeks. Lucia leaned against her mother's shoulder, trying to be brave despite the fear settling in her bones. "Tell us about home again," the girl requested, seeking comfort in stories of better days. Maria closed her eyes, summoning memories of warmth and safety to shield them from the harsh reality of their circumstances. As she spoke softly of sunlit fields and warm kitchens, her arms tightened around her children. She would protect them somehow. She had to. But as the night grew colder and darker, doubt crept in like frost, and Maria wondered if her strength alone would be enough to see them through until morning. John Silva's work-worn hands gripped the wooden fence as the morning sun cast long shadows across his land. The weathered rancher stared at the distant hills, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on his broad shoulders. He barely knew Maria Oliveira and her children, yet their desperate faces had lodged in his mind, refusing to leave him in peace. His ranch house, once filled with Anna's laughter, now echoed with emptiness that matched the hollow feeling in his chest. Redemption Ridge was the kind of small town where gossip traveled faster than the wind across the prairie. Everyone knew about John's solitary existence since Anna's passing 3 years ago. The whispers followed him whenever he ventured into town. How the giant cowboy had withdrawn into himself. How the once promising Silva Ranch had become merely functional rather than thriving. Even Dona Marta had mentioned it last month, her concern barely disguising her pity. "A man your size shouldn't be carrying all that grief alone," she'd said, while wrapping his supplies. He'd simply nodded and left, uncomfortable with the attention. Meanwhile, Maria huddled with Lucia and Pedro in the small shelter behind the livery where they'd spent another restless night. Her pride had kept them going this far, refusing handouts from the church, taking only odd jobs that wouldn't compromise her dignity. But as she brushed Lucia's tangled hair and tried to smooth Pedro's wrinkled shirt, she knew her options were vanishing like morning dew under the Brazilian sun. "We'll find something today," she promised, though her voice lacked conviction. Pedro's small face had grown too thin, his eyes too large for his hollow cheeks. Lucia, trying to be brave beyond her years, simply nodded and helped her brother tie his worn shoes. As they walked toward the general store, Maria rehearsed what she would say to Dona Marta. Perhaps there was work, sweeping floors, organizing shelves, anything to earn enough for a loaf of bread. The children trailed behind her, their gaunt faces a silent testimony to their need, their small shoulders already bearing burdens no child should carry. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the store, and Maria straightened her back, refusing to appear as desperate as she felt. Pride was the last possession she'd managed to keep after her husband's death, and she clung to it fiercely, even as her stomach twisted with hunger, and her children's eyes darted hopefully toward the shelves of food they couldn't afford. The bell above the door jingled as Maria Oliveira stepped into Dona Marta Costa's general store, her shoulders tense beneath her worn shawl. The store owner looked up from behind the counter, her eyes softening with recognition. Dona Marta's own shelves weren't as stocked as they once had been. Drought had affected everyone in Redemption Ridge this season. "Good morning, Maria," she greeted, noticing the hollow cheeks of the children. "What brings you in today?" Maria straightened her spine, dignity intact despite her circumstances. "I'm looking for work, Dona Marta. Anything at all." The storekeeper's face fell. "I wish I could help you. Business is slow, and my own family." She gestured helplessly at the half-empty shelves. In the corner of the store, 9-year-old Lucia held her brother's small hand, whispering stories about brave knights and magical horses to distract him. Pedro's stomach growled loudly, and the boy pressed his free hand against it, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "The horses have golden manes," Lucia continued, her voice barely audible, "and they never get hungry." Her eyes, too old for her young face, darted toward the bread display, then back to her brother. Maria pretended not to notice, though her heart clenched painfully. She turned back to Dona Marta, about to ask about other possibilities in town, when the floorboards creaked under heavy footsteps. John Silva ducked his head slightly to enter through the doorframe. His presence transformed the small space, making it seem even more cramped than before. The rancher nodded silently to Dona Marta, his usual greeting, and moved toward the supply section. Maria instinctively pulled her children closer, a protective gesture born from months of vulnerability. Her eyes betrayed her, however, lingering on the fresh bread loaves just beyond her reach, both financially and physically. John noticed. His weathered face remained impassive, but his attention caught on the family's threadbare clothes. The careful way the mother positioned herself between her children and the world. The girl, Lucia, he'd heard someone call her once, was whispering to her brother with a seriousness no child should have to carry. Something shifted in John's chest, a feeling he'd thought long buried with Anna. He recognized the fierce pride in Maria's posture, the refusal to beg despite desperate circumstances. It reminded him of his late wife's strength during the drought years. He watched as Pedro's small hand reached for his mother's skirt, tugging gently, his eyes never leaving the bread. Maria bent down, whispering something that made the boy nod reluctantly. John turned away, pretending to examine a shelf of tools. But his mind was already turning over a possibility he hadn't considered in years. John Silva's weathered gaze lingered on Maria Oliveira and her children. The rancher had come to Dona Marta's store for his monthly supplies, but found himself unable to look away from the quiet desperation etched on the widow's face. Her children, Lucia and Pedro, stood close to their mother, their hollow cheeks and wary eyes telling a story that pierced through his carefully constructed solitude. The giant cowboy shifted uncomfortably, his massive frame seeming out of place among the store's narrow aisles. He'd heard whispers about the Oliveira family's tragedy, a wagon accident that had claimed her husband's life, leaving behind nothing but debts and heartache. Now they were sleeping behind the livery, with winter's chill approaching fast. "Senora," John called out, his voice low and rough from disuse. The small family turned toward him, Maria's spine straightening with dignity despite her circumstances. He cleared his throat, searching for words that wouldn't sound like pity. "You're homeless, and I'm childless," he stated simply, his Portuguese accent thick but clear. "Come to my ranch. I give your children a roof. You give me a home." The store fell silent. Dona Marta pretended to arrange merchandise, but her ears were clearly tuned to their conversation. Maria's eyes widened, her hands instinctively tightening around Pedro's small shoulders. "What exactly are you proposing, Señor Silva?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's calloused hands twisted his hat brim. "A fair arrangement. The ranch needs tending inside. Been empty since Anna passed. Your children need food and shelter." He paused, then added, "No strings, separate rooms. You leave whenever you want." Maria's pride warred visibly with her desperation. She glanced down at Lucia, whose intelligent eyes were already calculating the offer, and Pedro, who couldn't hide a shiver as a draft swept through the store. "Why would you do this?" she questioned, suspicion edging her tone. The rancher's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the distant silhouette of his empty house on the hill. "Been alone too long," he admitted. "House needs life again." Maria closed her eyes briefly, weighing her children's future against her fears. The thought of another night behind the livery, of Pedro's increasingly hollow cough, of Lucia's attempts to hide her hunger pains, it all crashed down upon her maternal heart. "We accept," she finally said, not as a beggar receiving charity, but as a mother making a calculated decision for her family's survival. "But we will work for our keep. I won't be indebted to anyone." John nodded once, respect flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough. We leave when you're ready." The wagon creaked to a halt outside the Silva Ranch as the evening sun cast long shadows across the sprawling property. Maria Oliveira clutched her children's hands tightly, taking in the weathered but well-maintained two-story house that loomed before them. Lucia and Pedro pressed against their mother, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. John Silva hefted their meager belongings over his shoulder with ease, his imposing frame silhouetted against the dusky sky. "This way," he said simply, leading them up the porch steps that groaned under his weight. The family followed him inside, their footsteps echoing through roofs that hadn't known the patter of children in years. The rancher moved awkwardly through his own home, as if suddenly aware of how the space reflected his solitude. He showed them to a modest guest room with 2 beds and clean linens. "You can stay here," John explained, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Bathrooms down the hall, kitchens downstairs." He paused, searching for more words but finding none. "I'll be in my room if you need anything." Maria thanked him quietly, her pride still stinging despite her gratitude. After he left, she helped the children settle in, whispering reassurances as Pedro asked if they would have to leave again soon. Lucia, mature beyond her years, unpacked their few possessions with careful precision. That night, sleep came fitfully for everyone. Maria lay awake listening to her children's breathing, while down the hall, John stared at the ceiling of the bedroom he had once shared with Anna, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Maria rose quietly, leaving her exhausted children to sleep. She made her way downstairs, drawn to the kitchen by both habit and necessity. Perhaps she could prepare breakfast as a small token of appreciation. The kitchen revealed Anna's presence more clearly than any other room. Spice jars lined up by height on wooden shelves, each labeled in elegant handwriting. A worn recipe book lay open on the counter, notes scribbled in the margins in a delicate script. Copper pots hung from hooks, polished to a shine that spoke of loving care. Maria ran her fingers lightly over the countertop, feeling like an intruder in another woman's domain. She opened a drawer to find utensils arranged with meticulous precision. In another, neatly folded dish towels embroidered with wildflowers. This was her favorite room. John's voice startled her from the doorway. Maria turned, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "No need," he interrupted, his massive frame filling the entrance. "She would want it used." Standing there, surrounded by the ghost of John's past happiness, Maria wondered if she and her children could ever truly belong in this house, frozen in another woman's memory. The weight of Anna's absence felt as tangible as the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Silver Ranch as Lucia and Pedro ventured outside, their small hands gripping Maria Oliveira's skirt. Though they'd spent the night under a proper roof, the children remained wary of their new surroundings, eyes darting nervously at every unfamiliar sound. Lucia, despite her young age, positioned herself protectively between her brother and the vastness of the ranch, her shoulders squared with a maturity no child should need to possess. "Mama, look at the horses," Pedro whispered, pointing toward the corral where 3 muscular animals grazed. His voice carried a hint of wonder, breaking through his fear. From the barn doorway, John Silva observed the family's tentative exploration. His massive frame leaned against the weathered wood, hands fidgeting with his hat. The rancher recognized their apprehension. It mirrored his own. How could he connect with these children when memories of the family he'd lost with Anna still haunted every corner of his property? Maria guided her children toward the fence, explaining in hushed tones about ranch life. She'd grown up in town, but knew enough to name the basic tools and animals. When Pedro asked a question she couldn't answer, she glanced helplessly toward John, an unspoken request in her eyes. The breakfast table felt like neutral territory, though silence hung heavy between them. Maria had prepared a simple meal of eggs and bread, her movements careful in Anna's kitchen. The children ate slowly, stealing glances at the giant cowboy, who seemed equally uncomfortable with their presence. "Do the horses have names?" Pedro suddenly blurted out, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. The question caught John off guard. He set down his coffee cup, his weathered face softening slightly. "Yes," he replied, his deep voice gentler than before. "The brown one is Trovao. It means thunder." "Why thunder?" Lucia asked, speaking directly to him for the first time. "Because when he runs, the ground shakes," John explained, mimicking the sound with his hands against the table. Pedro giggled at the demonstration, a bright, unexpected sound that seemed to lighten the very air around them. Maria's eyes widened at her son's laughter, something she hadn't heard in weeks. "Could we see him run sometime?" Pedro asked, leaning forward eagerly. John's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "Tomorrow, perhaps. I need to check the fence lines. You could come along." Lucia exchanged a glance with her mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I know how to ride," Lucia claimed, though her experience was limited to a neighbor's donkey years ago. "Do you now?" John raised an eyebrow, amusement creeping into his voice. "We'll start slow." For a brief moment, laughter danced between them, tentative and fragile, but real. As they finished breakfast, the silence that returned felt different, less like a wall and more like a pause between conversations yet to come. Word of John Silva's unusual arrangement with Maria Oliveira spread through Redemption Ridge like wildfire. Whispers followed them at church, and curious glances tracked their movements at the general store. Maria kept her head high despite the gossip, focusing solely on her children's newfound security. Their fragile peace shattered one afternoon when Claudio Martins arrived at the ranch. The banker's expensive suit and polished boots seemed out of place against the weathered wood of John's porch. His cold smile never reached his eyes as he presented a leather portfolio filled with documents. "Your late husband's debts have accumulated substantial interest," he informed Maria, his voice as sharp as a newly minted coin. "I'm afraid the total sum is quite insurmountable for someone in your position." Maria's face paled as she scanned the figures. "This can't be right. Carlos never mentioned such large amounts." The banker adjusted his cuffs with manicured fingers. "Perhaps he wished to spare you the worry. Nevertheless, the law is clear." His gaze shifted deliberately toward Lucia and Pedro, who were playing near the barn. "In cases of extreme debt, minor children can be bound in service until the debt is cleared. They would be housed and fed, of course." The blood drained from Maria's face. "You can't mean—" "The courts have upheld such arrangements before," Martins continued smoothly. "Children are quick learners in household service." John, who had been silently observing from the doorway, stepped forward. His massive frame blocked the afternoon sun, casting a shadow over the banker. The rancher's weathered hands curled into fists at his sides. "These children are under my protection now," he stated, his voice low but carrying the weight of thunder across the prairie. "They will not be taken from this land while I draw breath." Martins didn't flinch. "Your sentiments are admirable, Senor Silva, but the law doesn't allow for stealing children," John interrupted. "Maria and her family are part of my household now. Any claims against them come through me first." The banker's smile tightened. "I see. Perhaps you're unaware that your own standing isn't as secure as you believe. There are old matters that could be revisited." Maria stepped closer to John, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. The gesture wasn't lost on Martins, whose eyes narrowed with calculation. "You have 1 week to make arrangements," he said, returning the papers to his portfolio. "After that, I'll be forced to pursue more official channels." As the banker's horse disappeared down the dusty road, Maria turned to John with terror in her eyes. "He can't really take my children, can he?" John's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Not while I'm here," he promised. "Not ever." Claudio Martin stormed away from the Silva Ranch, his polished boots kicking up dust that seemed to hang in the air like his threats. The banker had arrived that morning, with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm, his smile thin and predatory as he produced documents John had long forgotten. "These loans your father took, they were never fully settled," Martins had explained with false concern. "And now with interest, well, it's quite substantial. Of course, I could be persuaded to forget them if the Oliveira matter is resolved my way." John stood at the fence line now, watching the horizon as if it might offer answers. The ranch had been his family's for 2 generations. Every post, every barn board, every acre paid for with sweat and sacrifice. The thought of losing it all because he'd opened his home to a desperate woman and her children made his stomach twist. Inside the house, Maria moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, her hands busy with dinner preparations while her mind raced with worry. She'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand that her presence had brought trouble to John's doorstep. The rancher had been nothing but kind, offering shelter when no one else would, and now he might lose everything because of her. "Mama, is something wrong?" Lucia asked, her young eyes too perceptive for her age. She stood in the doorway, Pedro half hidden behind her as always. Maria forced a smile. "Nothing for you to worry about, querida. Why don't you both go help with the chickens?" After the children left, she sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the same place where Ana Silva had once planned meals and dreamed of the children she never had. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. She had brought children into this house, but might be the reason they all lost it. That night, sleep eluded her. The prairie wind whispered against the windows, sometimes gentle, sometimes howling like a warning. Maria stared at the ceiling, counting her heartbeats, wondering if she should take her children and disappear. Perhaps John could convince Martins that they'd gone, that he had no reason to pursue old debts. In his own room, John too lay awake, his large frame making the bed seem smaller than it was. He thought of Maria and her children, how Pedro had finally laughed yesterday when John showed him how to feed the horses, how Lucia's serious face had softened when he praised her reading. They were beginning to feel like family, the family he and Anna had dreamed of. He made his decision before dawn broke. The ranch was just land and buildings. The Oliveras were people who needed him, and for the first time in years, he needed them too. The moon cast long shadows across the Silva ranch as John stood before Anna's grave, his broad shoulders hunched against a weight heavier than any cattle he'd ever wrangled. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest as the night breeze rustled through the small cluster of wildflowers he'd planted around the simple wooden cross. "I don't know if this is right, Anna," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "These children need a home, and that woman—" He paused, unable to articulate the strange mixture of obligation and growing affection he felt toward Maria Oliveira. The rancher traced the carved letters of his late wife's name with weathered fingers. "I promised you I'd never forget, but I never promised to be alone forever." The silence that answered him was familiar, a companion he'd lived with for years. Yet somehow, it felt different now. The loneliness that had enveloped him like a second skin since Anna's passing no longer seemed inevitable. John realized with startling clarity that he'd chosen isolation, wrapping grief around himself like armor against further pain. Back at the house, Maria moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, her hands finding their way among Anna's carefully organized spices and utensils. She'd discovered a rhythm to the ranch work that gave her purpose. Each morning she rose before dawn, preparing breakfast before John headed out to the pastures, then tackled the endless chores with determined energy. "Mamay, look!" Pedro called from the yard where he was feeding chickens without being asked. His laughter, once so rare, now bubbled up more frequently, especially when John taught him small ranch tasks. Maria paused at the window, watching her son's face light up with pride. Inside, Lucia sat at the kitchen table, carefully mending one of Pedro's shirts. The girl had taken to helping with household tasks with surprising maturity, as if understanding the precarious nature of their arrangement with the taciturn rancher. "He's different when you're not looking," Lucia said softly, not lifting her eyes from her needlework. "Señor Silva, I mean. He smiles sometimes." Maria felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been kind to us," she replied, returning to the bread dough she was kneading. "Not just kind," her daughter insisted. "He watches us like we belong here." As dusk settled over the ranch, John returned from Anna's grave, his steps lighter than when he'd left. He paused at the porch, watching through the window as Maria and the children moved about his kitchen, their shadows dancing in the lamplight, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. The days at Silva Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Mornings began with the aroma of coffee and the sound of Maria Oliveira humming old folk songs as she prepared breakfast. John found himself lingering at the kitchen table longer than necessary, watching how she moved with purpose through what had once been Anna's domain, bringing warmth back to spaces that had grown cold with absence. "The cattle in the north pasture need checking," John would say, but what he meant was, "I'll be back for lunch." And Maria understood. The children were transforming too. Pedro, once withdrawn and fearful, now raced to the barn each morning to help with the horses, his small hands eager to learn every task John demonstrated. Lucia had discovered Anna's old books and would read by lamplight, occasionally looking up to ask John questions about words she didn't understand. The first time they called him Tio Juan, the words hung in the air like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. "They need a father figure," Maria explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the pastures gold. But I never told them to call you that. John nodded, something unfamiliar and warm expanding in his chest. The arrangement that had begun as charity was becoming something else, something that made the ranch feel like home again. But peace never lasts long enough. On a Tuesday morning, when the dew still clung to the grass, Claudio Martins arrived in a polished carriage, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. The banker stepped onto the porch with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm, ignoring Maria's greeting. "Legal papers," he announced, extending documents toward John. "The children are collateral for outstanding debts. Unless payment is made by Sunday, the court has granted me custody rights." Maria's face drained of color. "That's impossible," she whispered, reaching instinctively for John's arm. "The debt is more than anyone could pay in a lifetime." "Precisely the point." "Senora Oliveira," Martins replied with a thin smile, "perhaps you should have considered that before burdening honest citizens with your husband's failures." John stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Martins from Maria's view. "Get off my property," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. After Martins departed, the family gathered in the kitchen, the papers spread before them like a death sentence. Pedro didn't understand, but sensed the danger, pressing himself against Maria's side. Lucia, old beyond her years, studied the adults' faces and knew their newfound security was crumbling. "What will we do?" Maria asked, tears threatening. John looked at the three people who had somehow become his family and made a silent vow. "Whatever it takes," he answered. "Whatever it takes." The night wind rattled the shutters as Maria Oliveira finally crumbled. After weeks of maintaining a brave face for Lucia and Pedro, the weight of possibly losing her children became too much to bear. In the dim light of the kitchen, with the children finally asleep, she pressed her hands against her face and let the tears flow freely. John Silva found her there, shoulders shaking silently. The giant rancher, usually so stoic, felt something crack inside his chest at the sight. He awkwardly placed one work-worn hand on her shoulder. "They're all I have," Maria whispered, her voice breaking. "If Martins takes them, I'll have nothing left to live for." The cowboy pulled up a chair beside her, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. "I've been thinking," he said, his deep voice unusually gentle. "There might be a way to stop him." Maria looked up, hope flickering in her tear-stained face. "The law respects marriage," John continued, choosing his words carefully. "If we were husband and wife, your children would legally be under my protection. No banker could touch them then." The proposition hung in the air between them, startling in its simplicity, yet profound in its implications. "You would do that?" Maria asked, searching his eyes. "Marry a woman you barely know?" John nodded, his gaze steady. "This ranch has been silent too long. I've watched those children bring life back to this place. And you," he paused, unaccustomed to expressing feelings, "you've brought something back that I thought died with Anna." By morning, word had reached Judge Olivares, who arrived at Silva Ranch before noon. The ceremony was brief and practical, performed in the front room with Dona Marta and two ranch hands as witnesses. Lucia and Pedro watched wide-eyed as their mother promised herself to the tall, quiet man who had become their protector. When John slid Anna's simple gold band onto Maria's finger, their hands touched and lingered. Something unexpected passed between them, a current of warmth neither had anticipated. It wasn't love, not yet, but perhaps the foundation for something that might grow into it. "I'll honor this," John said quietly, for her ears alone. "Not just on paper." Maria nodded, understanding the depth of his promise. This arrangement had begun as a solution to a desperate problem, but as she looked into his eyes, she realized it might become something neither of them had dared hope for, a second chance at happiness. That night, as the newly formed family sat at dinner, Pedro asked innocently, "Does this mean we call you Papa now?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. The courthouse steps became a familiar sight as John and Maria Silva made their daily appearances, hand in hand, presenting the united front of a family fighting for survival. Whispers followed them through Redemption Ridge, some sympathetic, others suspicious of their hasty marriage. But the tall rancher walked with his shoulders squared, his protective stance around Maria and her children speaking louder than any wedding vows. "We need Dona Marta to testify about how the children have improved," Maria suggested one evening, her fingers nervously pleating the fabric of her skirt. "Pedro hasn't had that haunted look since he started helping with the calves." John nodded, his weathered face softening when he glanced at the boy asleep by the fireplace. "I'll speak with Señor Rodriguez too. He saw Lucia helping with the accounts. Says she has a head for numbers better than half the men in town." Their strategy worked. Neighbors who had initially raised eyebrows at their arrangement began stepping forward, offering testimonials about the transformation they'd witnessed. The children who once hid behind their mother now ran freely across the ranch, their laughter carrying on the prairie wind. Claudio Martins watched this growing support with mounting frustration. The banker spent evenings hunched over dusty records, searching for any weakness in their case. He unearthed Maria's humble origins, her husband's gambling debts, even a distant relative who had once been imprisoned. A woman of her background, Martins told anyone who would listen at the general store, cannot possibly provide moral guidance to those children. His cold eyes narrowed as he added, "And Silva? Marrying so soon after Ana? Disrespectful to her memory." But his attacks backfired. When he confronted Maria publicly about her late husband's debts, she stood tall despite her trembling hands. "Yes, my husband made mistakes," she acknowledged, her voice steady. "But my children deserve a chance at happiness. John has given us that chance." The store fell silent. Even Dona Marta, who had initially been skeptical, placed a supportive hand on Maria's shoulder. That evening, returning to the ranch, John found Maria crying softly in the kitchen. "Martins is right about one thing," she whispered. "I bring nothing but trouble to your door." John's large hand covered hers. "Before you came, this was just land and buildings," he said, his deep voice gentle. "Now it's a home again." Outside, they could hear Lucia reading a story to Pedro, their voices drifting through the open window. The sound seemed to settle something between them. A recognition that what had begun as an arrangement of necessity had grown roots too deep for Martins or anyone else to tear away. Maria Oliveira stood at the window of the Silva Ranch, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the curtains Ana had sewn years ago. The house was filled with these small reminders: a painted vase in the corner, carefully arranged spice jars in the kitchen, a quilt folded neatly on the rocking chair. Each object told the story of a woman Maria had never met, but whose presence she felt everywhere. "I'm living in her shadow," she whispered to herself, watching as John worked with the horses in the distance. Their legal marriage had protected her children, but in quiet moments like these, doubt crept in. How could she measure up to the memory of someone so beloved? That evening, as Maria prepared dinner, she found herself using Ana's recipes, following instructions written in elegant handwriting. John entered silently, watching her from the doorway. "You don't have to cook like she did," he said softly. Maria jumped, nearly dropping the wooden spoon. "I thought you might prefer familiar tastes." John crossed the room, his imposing frame softened by the gentle way he approached her. "I didn't bring you here to replace her," he said, his voice low and certain. "What Ana and I had is past. What we're building now, it's something new, something different." His honesty broke something open inside her. "Sometimes I feel like an intruder," she admitted, "like I'm borrowing someone else's life." "This life is yours now," he replied. "Ours." Outside, Lucia and Pedro were transforming under the wide Brazilian sky. Pedro, once too afraid to venture far from his mother, now galloped across the pasture on a gentle mare John had trained especially for him. His laughter, so rare after his father's death, now rang out freely, carried by the prairie wind. Lucia, serious beyond her years, had surprised everyone with her quick mind for numbers. She sat beside John each evening, helping him calculate feed costs and cattle prices, her small finger tracing columns with perfect precision. "She has a gift," John told Maria one night. "Reminds me of my father. He could add figures faster than anyone I knew." These small moments of connection were building something neither had expected. Not just a family of convenience, but one of genuine affection. The rancher, who had once been known only for his silence, now found himself telling stories at dinner, describing cattle drives and frontier adventures that made Pedro's eyes grow wide. Maria watched this transformation with wonder. The house that had once felt like a museum to another woman's life was slowly becoming their home. Not by erasing Anna's memory, but by adding new layers of life and laughter to its walls. The courthouse of Redemption Ridge had never been so crowded. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows as townsfolk packed the wooden benches, their whispers creating a nervous hum. John Silva sat ramrod straight beside Maria, his massive frame dwarfing the simple chair beneath him. His weathered hands, calloused from years of ranch work, occasionally brushed against hers in silent reassurance. Claudio Martins approached the bench with confident strides, legal documents clutched in his manicured hands. "Your Honor, the law is clear," he declared, voice dripping with practiced authority. "These children are collateral against substantial debts. The marriage is nothing but a convenient arrangement to circumvent legal obligations." The judge, an elderly man with eyes that had seen decades of human struggle, studied the papers through wire-rimmed spectacles. Maria felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Lucia and Pedro sitting quietly in the front row, their faces solemn beyond their years. "I'd like to hear from the children," the judge announced unexpectedly, silencing the murmurs. Lucia stood, her small frame trembling slightly as she approached. The courtroom fell silent. "Sir," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, "my brother and I want to stay with our mother and John." She paused, gathering courage. "Before we came to the ranch, we were always hungry and scared. Now, Pedro laughs again. I help with the horses. We have a home." The banker scoffed, but the judge raised his hand for silence. One by one, neighbors rose to speak. The blacksmith described how John had taught Pedro to care for the ranch animals. A schoolteacher testified about Lucia's improved studies. Even the town doctor mentioned how the children's health had flourished under proper care. When Dona Marta Costa stood, surprise rippled through the courtroom. The store owner had always kept to herself, rarely taking sides in town disputes. "I've known Maria since she first arrived with nothing but 2 hungry children," she stated firmly. "I watched her refuse charity even when they were starving. Now I see those same children come into my store with light in their eyes again." She looked directly at the judge. "That ranch has become a real home. Anyone with eyes can see it." John's throat tightened with emotion. He'd never expected the community to rally behind them this way. Maria's fingers found his, squeezing tightly as they waited. The banker made his final arguments, citing legal precedents and financial obligations, but something had shifted in the courtroom. The cold language of contracts seemed hollow against the living testimony of a family fighting to stay together. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, Maria closed her eyes and prayed. Everything they had built together hung in the balance of the next few words. The courtroom fell silent as the elderly judge adjusted his spectacles, reviewing the documents one final time. Maria Oliveira Silva clutched John's calloused hands so tightly, her knuckles whitened. Her eyes never left Lucia and Pedro, who sat rigid with anxiety on a nearby bench. The children's faces reflected the same desperate hope that pounded in her chest. John Silva remained outwardly stoic, but Maria could feel the slight tremor in his massive frame. This giant of a man, who had faced drought, bandits, and personal tragedy, now seemed vulnerable as they awaited the verdict that would determine their future. Having reviewed all testimonies and evidence, the judge began, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. I find that the welfare of the children is best served by remaining with their mother and stepfather. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Maria's knees buckled as relief flooded her system. John's arm shot out to steady her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. The court recognizes the legitimate family unit formed through marriage and demonstrated care, the judge continued. The Silva household has proven itself a nurturing environment where these children are thriving. Lucia and Pedro rushed forward, throwing themselves into their mother's arms. John enveloped all three in his embrace, his usual reserve crumbling as he whispered words of reassurance. Across the courtroom, Claudio Martins slammed his fist on the table. "This is outrageous!" The banker shouted, his face contorted with rage. "The debts are legal and binding. I demand—" "You'll demand nothing more from this family," the judge interrupted sharply. "And I suggest you moderate your tone in my courtroom." The banker's outburst only highlighted the contrast between his cold calculations and the genuine family bond before everyone's eyes. Several townspeople who had witnessed the proceedings exchanged knowing glances. "Martins has been squeezing folks dry for years," someone whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Donna Marta, who had testified on the family's behalf, nodded in agreement. Perhaps it's time the town examined his books more carefully. As the Silva family made their way outside, neighbors approached with congratulations and offers of support. The rancher acknowledged each with quiet gratitude, his arm protectively around Maria's shoulders. "This isn't over," Martins hissed as he brushed past them toward the door. "No one challenges me and wins." But his threats rang hollow now. The whispers had already begun. Questions about interest rates, foreclosures, and missing funds. The banker's power, built on fear and secrecy, was crumbling in the face of a community awakened by the courage of one unlikely family. Walking into the sunlight, Maria looked up at John, seeing not just her protector, but her partner in this hard-won victory. Together, they had created something neither had believed possible, a real home built from the broken pieces of their past. The ride back to Silva Ranch was silent, each of them lost in thoughts too profound for words. As they crossed the threshold of the home they'd fought so hard to keep, the reality of their victory finally washed over them. Maria Oliveira collapsed onto the worn sofa, her body shaking with sobs that were equal parts relief and exhaustion. "We won," she whispered, opening her arms as Lucia and Pedro rushed to her embrace. "We're home." John stood in the doorway, his imposing frame softened by the afternoon light. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly hope. The ranch that had been a monument to his grief was transforming before his eyes into something alive again. "Tio João," Pedro called, extending his small hand. "Come here with us." The rancher joined them, his calloused hands gentle as they encircled the family. Lucia buried her face against his shoulder, no longer the wary child who had arrived months ago, but a girl who knew she was safe. "I never thought we'd have this again," Maria said, her voice breaking as she looked at her children. "A real home." Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep, exhausted by emotion, Maria busied herself in the kitchen. She wanted to prepare something special to celebrate their victory. As she reached for Anna's recipe book, a folded paper slipped from between its pages. Her hands trembled as she recognized it as a letter, written in the same delicate script as the recipes. It was addressed simply, "To whoever loves him after me." Maria sank into a chair, uncertain if she should read something so intimate. Curiosity and respect battled within her until she carefully unfolded the paper. "I don't know who you are," Anna had written. "But if you're reading this, you've found your way to John's heart. He deserves every happiness, even when he believes he doesn't. Love him completely, but don't try to erase me. Make new memories in these rooms where I was once happy." Tears blurred Maria's vision as she continued reading the letter from a woman she'd never met, but whose presence she'd felt in every corner of this house. When John found her, Maria was still holding the letter, her face streaked with tears. "She knew," Maria said simply, holding out the paper. "She wanted you to be happy again." John read the words slowly, his broad shoulders shaking with emotion. When he looked up, his eyes held not grief, but gratitude. "I think she would have liked you," he said softly. Maria nodded, feeling not jealousy, but a strange kinship with the woman who had loved this man before her. "I'll honor her by making this a happy home again," she promised. With Claudio Martins facing embezzlement charges and his influence crumbling throughout Redemption Ridge, the Silva family found themselves surrounded by unexpected support. Neighbors who had once whispered behind their backs now brought baskets of food and offers of help with the autumn harvest. John Silva stood taller these days, the weight of isolation finally lifting from his broad shoulders. "I never thought I'd see the day when this town would stand with us," Maria told John one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. She reached for his calloused hand, no longer just seeking security but genuine connection. "People respect courage," he replied simply, his voice still carrying that hint of gruffness that might never fully disappear. Their plans for the ranch expanded with each passing week. John taught Maria about cattle breeding and crop rotation, while she brought order to the household accounts that had fallen into disarray during his years of solitude. Together, they discussed building an additional room for the children and perhaps expanding the corral for new horses. Pedro, now 8 years old, shadowed John everywhere, absorbing ranch life like a sponge. The boy who had once been too afraid to speak now whistled constantly as he helped with chores, a cheerful melody that drifted across the pastures. John taught him to ride properly, to mend fences, and to respect the land that sustained them. "Listen to the wind," John instructed one afternoon as they repaired a broken gate. "It tells you everything you need to know about tomorrow's weather." Pedro nodded seriously, his small face intent with concentration. Meanwhile, Lucia had discovered the small bookshelf in what had been Anna's sewing room. The 12-year-old devoured every volume on ranching, horses, and land management she could find. Maria often found her daughter with soil samples or sketching maps of the property, planning improvements with a dedication that impressed even John. "She has your determination," John told Maria one night after the children had gone to bed. "And your stubbornness," Maria replied with a smile. Music returned to the ranch house too. Maria's soft singing filled the kitchen as she prepared meals. And in the evenings, John surprised everyone by producing an old violin that had belonged to his father. Though rusty at first, his playing improved, and soon the family gathered regularly around the fireplace, the melodies chasing away the last ghosts of loneliness. Dona Marta remarked to neighbors that she hardly recognized the Silva Ranch anymore. "That place was like a tomb before," she said. "Now it's bursting with life." And it was true. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had transformed into something neither John nor Maria could have imagined. A home built on choice rather than circumstance, and a future bright with possibility. The autumn leaves were turning gold when Maria Silva placed a hand over her still flat stomach, her eyes meeting John's across the breakfast table. The words tumbled out softly, almost afraid to take form. She was expecting a child. John's coffee cup froze midway to his lips, his weathered face transforming from confusion to wonder in the span of a heartbeat. "A baby?" he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. The giant cowboy, usually so stoic, felt tears welling in his eyes. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and knelt beside Maria's chair, placing his calloused hand gently over hers. "I know it's unexpected," Maria said, her voice trembling, "after everything with Martins and the ranch just getting back on its feet." John shook his head, cutting off her worries. "This is a blessing," he said firmly, "one I never thought I'd have again after Anna." The mention of his late wife no longer brought the sharp pain it once had, just a gentle acknowledgement of a love that had prepared his heart for this new family. When they told Lucia and Pedro that evening, the children's reactions were immediate and joyful. Lucia, practical as always, began listing names in her careful handwriting, while Pedro bombarded John with questions about whether the baby would like horses as much as he did. "Can I teach the baby to ride?" Pedro asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "When they're old enough," John promised, ruffling the boy's hair. "Just like I taught you." In the weeks that followed, the Silva Ranch buzzed with preparations. Pedro collected smooth stones from the creek to make a rattle, while Lucia sewed a small quilt from fabric scraps Dona Marta had given her from the general store. The entire household seemed to breathe with new purpose. Maria watched these changes with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Late one night, John found her sitting alone on the porch, staring at the stars scattered across the Redemption Ridge sky. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered as he sat beside her. "Last time, with Lucia and Pedro, I had nothing to give them after their father died." John took her hand, his touch gentle despite years of ranch work. "You gave them everything that mattered," he said. "Courage, love, the strength to survive." He placed his arm around her shoulders. "And now we do this together." Their partnership, born of necessity and sealed in the courthouse, had blossomed into something neither had dared hope for. A love built on shared struggles and quiet moments of understanding. As Maria leaned against John's solid frame, she realized that the family they were building was stronger than any she could have imagined during those desperate nights behind the livery. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the walls of the Silva Ranch living room. Outside, the prairie wind whistled through the eaves, but inside, warmth enveloped the family, gathered on worn leather chairs and handmade quilts. Maria Oliveira Silva cradled her swollen belly while John sat beside her, his large hand resting protectively near hers. Lucia, her eyes reflecting the firelight, looked up from the book of horse breeds she'd been studying. "Mama," she asked suddenly, her voice soft but clear, "do you think Anna would be happy that we're here, in her home?" The question hung in the air. Pedro stopped whittling the small wooden horse John had been teaching him to carve, and even the rancher himself grew still, his weathered face unreadable in the flickering light. Maria took a deep breath, her hand finding John's. "I believe she would," she answered honestly. "From everything John has told me about her, Anna loved this house because it was meant to be filled with family." She glanced around at the walls that had once echoed with emptiness. "I think she would prefer it to be a home with laughter and muddy boots by the door, rather than a quiet place where memories gather dust." John's eyes glistened as he squeezed her hand. "Anna always said a house needs children to become a home," he added, his voice rough with emotion. "She would have adored you both." Pedro scooted closer to John, leaning against the big man's side. "I wish I could have met her," he said simply. "In a way, you have," John replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "Her recipes feed us, her garden still grows, and her kindness lives in how we treat each other." Maria watched as Lucia crossed the room to examine the small portrait of Anna that still hung on the wall. The girl studied it thoughtfully before turning back to them. "She had your smile," Lucia said to John. "Kind, even when it's hiding." The rancher's face softened at the child's perception. "Love doesn't disappear," he said, looking from Lucia to Maria. "It just finds new places to grow." Maria nodded, understanding flowing between them. "We don't need to forget what came before to build what comes next," she said. "We honor both, what was lost and what was found." As the fire settled into glowing embers, the family remained together, their silhouettes merging into one shadow against the wall of the ranch house. They made no grand declarations, but in that moment, they silently promised to create a future that respected the past while embracing the present. A family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and circumstance, stronger for having weathered the storms together. The portrait hung above the fireplace captured a moment 5 years in the making. John Silva standing tall behind Maria, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, while Lucia and Pedro flanked them on either side, their faces alight with genuine happiness. In Maria's arms, their 2-year-old daughter Anna, named in honor of a memory now cherished rather than mourned, giggled as she reached for the painter. The Silva Ranch had transformed from a place of echoing emptiness to a thriving home. The cattle herds had doubled, the fields yielded abundant harvests, and the once silent rooms now resonated with conversations, arguments, and laughter. John, no longer the solitary giant cowboy of Redemption Ridge, moved through his days with purpose, teaching Pedro the art of roping cattle, while marveling at how quickly the boy had grown. Maria had made the ranch house truly hers, blending her own traditions with the foundation Anna had left behind. The recipe book now contained both women's handwriting, a testament to continuity rather than replacement. She often caught her husband watching her with a look of wonder, as though still surprised by the fullness of their shared life. Lucia, now 14, had become her father's right hand in managing the ranch accounts. The townspeople remarked how she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. When Claudio Martins had finally left town in disgrace after his banking practices were investigated, it was Lucia who had suggested they celebrate with a feast under the stars. "Remember when we first came here?" Pedro asked one evening as the family gathered on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold. At 12, he retained little of the frightened, hungry child he'd once been. "I was so scared of everything, even the horses. And now we can't get you off them," his mother replied, adjusting little Anna on her lap. John's laugh rumbled through the evening air. "The ranch needed all of you, more than you needed it," he said, his voice soft with gratitude. That night, after the children were asleep, Maria found her husband standing by the window, looking out at the land that had witnessed their unlikely journey. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "That day in the store when you made your offer?" The rancher turned to her, the lines around his eyes deepening as he smiled. "Not for a single moment," he answered, pulling her close. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of tomorrow across the land they now shared. The Silva family had found their redemption not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to love despite fear, to hope despite loss, and to build a home where once there had been only emptiness.